Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. Back in the mid-1980s, this curmudgeon was a little curmudgeon, a young boy, but still aware enough of his surroundings, enough that he, meaning me, remembers when there was a revival of interest in the iconic 1960s band The Doors. Their music was ubiquitous on classic rock radio. Young rock bands of the day were name-dropping them. You could hear their music in movies and TV shows. And the band's deceased lead singer, Jim Morrison, was popping up on the covers of countless music-based magazines. This revival seemed to reach its apotheosis when, in 1991, Oliver Stone released his full-blown biopic film about the band. Despite Val Kilmer's brilliant performance as Morrison, the movie barely made a profit, and it was panned by critics for its many historical inaccuracies. More importantly, though, Morrison's portrayal in the film, as written by Stone, didn't do the late Morrison any favors. He was portrayed as an egotistical, selfish dickhead, consumed by his alcoholism and seemingly acting like a belligerent, drunken clown 24 hours a day. This is important because this marks the time when a cultural backlash against the Doors started, particularly among the younger generation of rock music fans of the day, the Generation X crowd. All of a sudden, it became cool and like a badge of hipness to dislike and criticize the Doors and deem them overrated. In ensuing years, it's difficult to believe that many music fans of the millennial and Gen Z generations watched the Oliver Stone film, but the backlash and the hate from Gen Xers most certainly carried over. The Doors are still iconic, but post-Gen X rock fans of today have essentially codified them as a baby boomer generation band that has no relevance today, nor, more importantly, to any of the eras of rock after the 1960s. Well, yours truly curmudgeons are here to tell you that this is absolute fucking bullshit. The Doors were a fantastic band, one of the very best of their era, and yes, an extremely underrated and unsung influence on countless bands and artists throughout the years. On this episode, we're going to break down all 6 of the Morrison-era albums and highlight the brilliance in each of them, even the lesser albums. We're also going to passionately and correctly debunk 5 of the most pervasive myths about the band. It's about time the indie hipster douchebag set, and generally people with shitty taste in music, got put in their place regarding this great band. This is In Defense of the Doors. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Yeah, excited we get to defend the Doors, but before we talk about those doors, we need to walk through another set of doors. And where are we going, do you think?
Let me guess. To the parallel universe.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, we do this like bad science fiction riff every episode, but it still works. There's the music, and we're heading over into the other side of the space-time continuum, folks, where blue is green and white is black, and rock and roll still predominates, and it's still a thing that you don't necessarily have to spend $18.99 for a disc. Over in the parallel universe, we don't make you waste your money over there.
Yeah.
But anyway, rock and roll is still on the billboards, and the Doors are still celebrated by millennials, and it's all good. It's in the arenas, it's on the billboards, it's on the cover of Rolling Stone, it's on the radio. Rock and roll is still a thing. And so that's a long way of saying that this is a segment where we cover albums by new and newish artists that we think that you ought to dig and that you ought to get into. There's occasional disagreement between us when we pick these. And I don't think that this episode will be any different. That said, who are you recommending on this episode here with the Parallel Universe, Arturo?
Yeah, this is the second time we'll be talking about Yard Act, the
Third
British
time. Third time.
Second time, I think. They only have two albums.
Third time. I covered the single. I covered Trenchcoat Museum.
You did. That's right. That's right. I forgot.
Yeah.
Okay, you are
no
correct.
Worries.
Hey. Yes. Well, the British indie rock band Yard Act put out their debut album, The Overload, 2 years ago. It made it to both of yours truly Curmudgeon's top 10 lists for that year. Now, calling this a parallel universe selection is only works for the United States because in the UK they're actually pretty big. And their album, the previous album, Overload, went as far as number 2 in the UK album chart. They are pretty popular over there in the UK and Europe. It's the US, and so it's a parallel universe North American edition.
Yes.
But anyway, basically, here's my line on Yard Act. They aren't the first British band to do funky, dancey, angular, guitar-driven indie rock with chanted spoken word vocals full of socio-political commentary. Damn, they are so good at it.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
Comparing their new album, Where's My Utopia, which is the name of the new album, to their first one is a bit unfair because it's a very, very different kind of album altogether. Musically, they seem to be at a point of juxtaposition where on one hand, they delve into pure, catchy, danceable indie pop. On the other, they're waist deep in experimental, esoteric art rock. Very often, the dichotomy is displayed within the same song. It's very expansive too. Disco, dub reggae, string arranged pop, and old school hip hop beats are now part of Yard Act's sonic stew. The hip hop influence in particular is pronounced with radio and TV broadcast samples littered throughout the record. And then there's the band's frontman, James Smith. First of all, he does more actual singing than ever before on this album. Second, his lyrics, while still maintaining their social critiques and tales of class conflict, are more introspective. He's a father of a young son now, and the impact of that new fatherhood is clearly apparent on the track Down by the Stream, a story of childhood bullying that cuts off at the end, transitioning into a musical drone while Smith goes off in a kind of a spoken word rant on how he yearns to teach his son how not to be a bully and not to repeat the mistakes of his father. The song Blackpool Illuminations is perhaps the most startling track on the whole record. To a backdrop of skittering Afrobeat music and delicious guitar work, Smith tells a story of childhood trauma that occurred while he was on holiday with his family in Blackpool. In the middle of the song, he changes his delivery from a standard spoken word narration to a rhythmic sing-speak rhyme. It's easy to miss, but once you zero in on it, it's quite jarring and done brilliantly as well. He goes from spoken word to rapping just seamlessly, and you barely notice it. Anyway, that's one of the two or three great tracks on the album. There's several other ones, I think. Where's My Utopia is neither better than nor worse than their debut album. But what Yard Act pull off here is an invigorating and admirable expansion of their musical parameters and palette. James Smith has grown as both a vocalist and lyricist, merging the personal and the political into a seamless whole. It's a really good, terrific album, I think, that proves Yard Act are one of the best young bands in rock right now. I give it a solid 4 out of 5 stars. Chris?
Yes, this definitely is one of the best young bands in the world. I love The Overload. It was number 2 on my list of the best albums of 2022. James Smith is a singular talent. Just so many words, so little time. He has an economy to him, and he's got a shtick but he's more than the shtick. I think he's got a lot to say, and he's got different ways of saying it within the paradigm. As Arturo said, they're very dancey, or have gotten dancier in their music, and and that really leads to some opportunities for humor, but also some insight. I love the song "We Make Hits."
Yeah.
I also love Dream Job.
Yeah.
Those are, with that kind of dance bass, that kind of portends a direction that I'd like to see them keep going. I also like Petroleum and When the Laughter Stops. I think that there's just a really good cross section of stuff here. So far, and I have to spend more time with it. One thing about the Overload is that it grew on me over the course of months.
I think
Uh,
this one will too.
yeah, and that's what I need to do. I need to, because this just came out earlier
Yeah.
in March 2024, and so I need to spend more time with it. But this album, so far, I really really like. I like the fact that Smith is exiting his comfort zone a little bit and trying more things out with his voice and actual singing, and just trying to prove to the world that he's more than just a shtick.
Mm. Yeah.
I really am excited for this band. I think that they are one of the best young bands in the world, and I'd love to see where they are in 3 or 4 years. I think they're going to keep maturing and keep getting that much better. They're definitely a band worth celebrating. Another band that I think, strangely enough, speaking of the benefiting from repeated listens, that this is a band that they're nowhere near. They're not like Yard Act at all. They're
Gee, you
it
think?
yeah, it's basically a 180. This is a band called Liquid Mike, and Liquid Mike, and this is an album called Paul Bunyan's Slingshot. As the name suggests, this band hails from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, specifically the little college town of Marquette, Michigan. And they're an interesting story. The lead singer is a guy named Mike Maple, or the band leader, songwriter. He's a mailman by day. So this is, so your post office worker, your mailman might actually be delivering some of the best hooks that anybody will drop onto the street this year. So let's talk a little bit more about Liquid Mike and this album. They're fifth in 3 years, by the way. Paul Bunyan's Slingshot. Liquid Mike comes bearing hooks, one after another, on its new album, Paul Bunyan's Slingshot. They've made what increasingly has become my favorite kind of album: long on songs and short on runtime. Here, that equals 13 songs that take 25 minutes and 41 seconds to bang out. This band clearly also worships at the altar of numerous power pop and pop punk bands, Guided by Voices, Everclear, Weezer, Blink-182, early Foo Fighters, and Jawbreaker, just to name a few. But they don't do it haphazardly, like a lot of other bands. Like I think a lot of folks are hearing some of those influences in some of those bands. Well, like every other rock band that hits Bandcamp kind of fits that profile. Well, but these guys don't do it haphazardly, and that's the difference. They actually do it with conviction and with smarts and with chops. And that's the difference here. And they sing big, fat, riffy songs with sing-songy choruses and surprisingly literate verses. Quote, "Given what you know, the American dream is a Michigan hoax," sings band leader Mike Maple, a mailman by day in the Upper Peninsula town there of Marquette, Michigan, as I said. He sings that on the bouncy Mousetrap. These are well-crafted songs that ruminate on the bored facts of Midwestern life. These range from the back-assward kids who run from nowhere to nowhere, quote, "from nowhere to nowhere," great lyric, on the rip-rocking USPS, which is probably the best song in the album, to the miscreants swimming in the neighbor's yard on the rousing album opener, "Drinking and Driving." These are loser anthems for stuck locals and overgrown misanthropes. Quote, "We got old, but act the same. Only traffic lights and the weather change. Then the earth dried up, now it never rains. But my friends still call when they want to hang," goes the first verse to American Caveman, another engaging punky nugget. How's that for simple self-awareness? This album could use a little variety after a while, and
You
things do.
don't you don't say.
Yeah, and then things do peter out in the last third of the record. I will say this that there's about 18 great minutes out of 26, and so there's that issue. But Mike Maple does have an ear for hooks and an appealing, ever overgrown towny sensibility. Basically, he's like every overgrown townie you've ever met, and he's got that sensibility, and that could eventually take him well beyond the familiar confines of Marquette, Michigan. Just as for some other color on this band, so they were nowhere. They were basically a band that was just like putting stuff down on wax and sharing it among their friends. They were basically a nobody band, and then somebody tweeted about them on what's now known as X, used to be Twitter, and tweeted about said this band is fucking awesome. And for some reason that tweet went viral, and folks checked them out to the point where Stephen Hayden, the really good writer, rock writer, just did a profile of them on Uprocks. So this is a band that literally nobody outside of Marquette, Michigan had ever heard of. That all of a sudden got strapped on the engines early last year. This was after they released a self-titled record, and that album was 11 songs and 18 minutes, which probably means it was better.
17 minutes too long.
Oh, stop. So, I mean, so yeah, I said really intriguing story and one of the more surprising albums I've heard in a long time because, like I said, just given the description of that power pop that splices guided by voices with Everclear, you'd think you'd want to puke, but nope. Really, really great stuff. Really, really smart stuff. And I think that this is a band with a future. Arturo, I'm guessing by some of your snide comments, you disagree.
Dude, I love you, man, but this album is one serious shower of shit. I won't spend too much time describing this train wreck of a record, but basically, it's an unholy amalgam of 1990s pop punk, which is about 90% garbage, combined with the worst of generic cliche 1990s indie rock. It sounds like a bunch of untalented kids who like Blink 182 a little too much and learned all the wrong lessons from Jimmy Eat World. Liquid Mike are essentially the argument for having more gatekeepers in music because no A&R person working for a major record label would in their right mind sign this band, much less listen to more than 5 minutes of their atrocious music, which is something that I unfortunately did.
Yeah, but
one out of 5 stars, and that's being generous.
But that says more about the A&R men than it does about Liquid Mike. I think that we've become so jaded that this like it's no secret that among rock and roll genres of the last 30 years, this might be the most saturated. This sort of this power pop,
this and emo.
yeah, power pop, emo punk, this sort of cross section of things. Of course, it's overly saturated, but I think that what we've done is people and A&R men and critics and guys like you and me have become a little too conditioned to be dismissive. As soon as we hear that, as soon as we hear a poppy bouncy hook, we're like, oh, here we go again.
Dude,
no.
First of all, it's not that hooky. Second of all, I was down on this music when it was coming out in the 1990s.
I know you were.
I hated this shit even back then.
Yeah, I never liked Blink 182, but I did like all those other bands. I was a big fan of Everclear, actually. I always thought that band was underrated.
See, I don't think Everclear were a pop punk band. I think Everclear were like
they were punk. Yeah,
they were more like they were like more like pop grunge,
Yeah, pop grunge. They had more in common with Social D than they did with Blink 182.
Right.
So I know that, but even like early Foo Fighters had Big Me kind of stuff. This just kind of harkens back to some of that, and to me, it's this is one of those things where we have to do our duties as rock geek iconoclasts and really listen and to be fair. I think it's hard. It's hard to be fair to bands like Liquid Mike and to albums like Paul Bunyan's Slingshot. But I think if we come into it fair-minded and we really give it a good listen and we give it more and we spend time with it, there's surprises to be had. Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming. Let's now start talking about the Doors, folks. The Doors, you know them. If you're listening to this podcast, of course, you know them. Chances are you have an opinion about them, and chances are many of you don't have a very good opinion of them, and some of that is not your fault. I think that this is a band that has kind of fallen victim to its own hype and to its own stereotypes over the years. And so as one generation transfers to another, then transfers to another, and now we're starting to transfer to another, all that's left is the one sentence or two sentence caricature or sketch of the band, and a lot of what made them great gets left behind, or there's not as much of a desire to dive in because you're stuck with those prevailing images. So that's why we're defending the Doors, because we have taken up the mission. It's not a great world for content like ours right now, with what's happened to like Pitchfork and BuzzFeed and Vice and others than that. But we are offering you a vestige of depth that is being lost. And so here's an opportunity to go deep on the Doors and to discover a band that has been really unfairly maligned and frankly shit on. We're trying to counter that. And so as we start, those of us, you who've been listening to us for a long time, we do these in defense of record episodes once in a while, these in defensive episodes where we start by dispelling 5 myths about a band, and that's what we're going to do here. So we're dispelling 5 myths about the Doors. Arturo, first myth for you to attack: the Doors were pretentious.
Chris, I'll let you take this one first because I have a feeling you'll have something better to say about this than me. I'll take you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Basically, again, this is one where the myth-making machine twists and bends into a bad narrative. When you think about the Doors, there's really 2 prevailing images that we associate with the Doors, just casually. There's the guy in the leather pants and no shirt singing "Light My Fire," and then there's the fat guy with the big bushy beard singing "Roadhouse Blues." And about basically he woke up this morning and got himself a beer. The end is near. And so we really leave nothing in between. So you have Sex God on the one end and dirty bar band blues rocker on the other. But those were really just 2 moments in time from a otherwise rich catalog. And so you get past that. This band was not pretentious. They actually were legitimately artistic. They were legitimately groundbreaking. They put a lot of insight into their music. They took a lot of chances. There was a lot of experimentation. There were a lot of profound artistic statements. Just looking at a couple of instances in their catalog, the Firing Squad in the middle of The Unknown Soldier, which is on their 3rd album, Waiting for the Sun. That's a really moving moment, because at that point you're not really sure where he's going. Is this unknown soldier an existential or a sort of an ethereal creation? No, he actually is a real guy who is in the midst of a bleak war. And then in the next lyric, he ends up getting shot in the helmet. And so just little touches like that really are what really make this band. Or then you take the music to the end. I think a lot of folks will associate the end with the beginning of the movie Apocalypse Now, with that snaking, beautiful guitar and an organ riff that just lurks and menaces and just offers a spooky vision of apocalypse. And even some of the lyrics on that, I mean, this is legitimate. This is earnest bullshit poetry.
Yeah.
About the blue bus
Right.
and riding the snake and all of that. This isn't pretentious. This is just psychedelic visions of terror. Uh,
Right. Yeah, no, they
it,
were
it- yeah,
a lot of the Doors lyrics are just dark, eerie, and really ominous and kind of disturbing in a good
yeah,
way.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're evocative.
Yeah.
You're supposed to feel something, and
Right.
so there's not that, and that's not pretentious. And really, at the end of the day, that they're just too experimental to be truly phony. I mean,
Right.
take like the Moog synthesizer touch on "Strange Days," the
Right.
title song to "Strange Days." I mean, if you're going to sing "Strange Days Have Found Us," it probably suits the song to make the proceedings as strange as possible.
Yeah.
Uh, and so these touches were smart, and they were not like, hey, look at us. It all was in service of the songs and in service of the art. And so and then there's the also the other thing to talk about too, which is that their music was generally too steeped in the blues.
Yes.
There
Well,
was a
the blues, they ended up being straight up blues band by the very, very end.
oh, I know. And
But they were
so
steeped in a lot of stuff, though, not just
yeah,
blues.
they were steeped. I mean, well, yeah, they covered Bert Holt Brick and Kurt Weill. The first Kurt Weill
The
on
German one.
the German one. They actually covered them on the first record, and so I mean they're a little too steeped in roots music to really to and a little too well versed. So those are all the arguments against them being pretentious. They meant what they did, and they did what they meant.
Right.
Arturo?
Yeah, there's a difference between being pretentious and artistically ambitious.
Yes.
Right.
That is a really great way to put it.
Yeah.
And any other thoughts on the ambition of this band?
No, that was it. I think you hit on it. It's exactly it. I mean, I'm going to hit on them more as we go on. So let's move on to the second myth.
Okay. The second myth, Jim Morrison, frontman Jim Morrison, was incessantly a belligerent drunken clown.
Now, yes, when Morrison was drunk, he could very much be that. However, according to everyone who knew him, particularly his bandmates who reiterated this in numerous interviews throughout the years, there was a completely different side to him when alcohol was not involved. And no, unlike what the Oliver Stone movie suggested, he was not shit faced all the time. He was a very intelligent, well-read guy who could be quite quiet and introspective. He was, by all accounts, really easy to get along with and a very generous person. There's Ray Manzarek has a great line when he pulled out of the production of the Doors movie because of all the historical inaccuracies that Oliver Stone was putting in there. He said that he saw the movie later on in the theater, and he came out of the theater thinking, "Man, that guy's an asshole," referring to Jim Morrison. It's like that's not the guy that I knew.
Yeah,
And he may be right. Listen, rock and roll myth making can make cartoons or caricatures out of
yeah,
people.
absolutely.
And
Hmm.
over time, that's exactly what has unfortunately happened to Morrison. Thanks, Oliver Stone.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's a quote from this interview, and I'll quote it from a few times. Morrison did an interview with Howard Smith of the Village Voice in early 1970, which is a really kind of fascinating kind of back and forth, almost stream of consciousness. It's like the least formed, structured interview I've ever seen. But he, at one point, Morrison says, "quote, I don't really think we have the key to the pulse of the nation because we've made more mistakes than we've been right."
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that kind of thoughtfulness, like you said, was really what Morrison was about. That he put a lot of thought into what he did, and he wasn't just yeah. And granted, 5 to 1 is a pure swaggering piece of controlled id, but there's also a purpose to that as well. I think that
Right.
he's playing a character in that
Mm.
song, and so I think that's the other thing too is that Morrison had he almost had like a dramatic range. I mean, he was interested in filmmaking, and so people don't realize half of his songs at least he was playing characters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of his songs. He was in character, role play. He did a
Yeah.
lot of that.
Yeah,
Really did.
absolutely. And then, you read about, the basic narrative of the Doors, and a lot of it does have to do with Morrison's alcoholism and his mercurialness. And obviously, there was an incident in Miami where he kind of melted down on stage and apparently was accused of exposing himself and ended
Yeah,
up, with a big court case that became this big saga. And if you read the narrative, he was at his worst, or he was at his least stable or least engaged in the middle of their catalog, and that would be the third album, Waiting for
right.
the Sun, and the fourth album, The Soft Parade.
Hmm.
But even there, his artistic output was riveting. That
Yeah,
he wasn't phoning it in. I mean,
right,
hell, on the Soft Parade, I mean the interesting stuff. I mean, that's kind of a disjointed mess of a record,
right,
but the interesting stuff almost all comes from Morrison. you
right.
know,
Yeah,
like the Soft Parade, and some of the other stuff, Wild Child.
right.
It just so even at his worst, he was still engaging. So
Yeah.
no, he wasn't a clown at all.
Right. And this goes into the myth number three, Chris.
Yes, that Jim Morrison was untalented, which is just a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah,
All you have to do is listen to the song "The Soft Parade,"
right. Yeah, I
and
know. Yeah. I mean,
and you understand you're
sure.
dealing with a preternaturally talented creature.
Right. I mean, Morrison considered himself a poet and wanted to be taken seriously as one. He
Yep,
published a few books during his lifetime that were badly panned by literary critics. However, this does not mean he was an untalented hack. Unfortunately, Morrison could never come to terms with the fact that his true talent was singing and being a vocalist and being an onstage performer. His sonorous baritone was unlike any other singer of his era, and he had range too. He could go from crooning to
yep.
delicate phrasing to higher register singing to full throated rock and roll roar. He was hands down not only one of the greatest rock singers of his era, if not the best, he was one of the greatest rock singers of all time, whose influence on multiple generations of rock singers is immeasurable, as we'll go into specifics about later on in this episode.
Yeah, it's like,
As
the same guy sang The Crystal Ship and L.A. Woman.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
Yeah,
as for his words, while they may not have worked well as poetry, as music lyrics, they were excellent, rich
yep.
in vivid imagery, and having a real sense of surrealism and unsettling dread. You know,
Yeah,
Chris.
no, absolutely. I mean, even some of the poetry stuff sometimes worked. I mean, like
Mm,
again, the Soft Parade, where starts off by screaming, you cannot petition the Lord with prayer,"
yeah,
and having this line about finding a place to hide and finding soft asylum. And then he segues into these like surrealist lyrics about catacombs and nursery bones and winter women growing stones,
mm,
and just kind of going all over the place. And it becomes a real set piece. I mean, it's like a almost like a spoken word piece in like
yeah,
five movements.
yeah,
And it just really becomes compelling. And he also, like, even as a thinker, you can't say that anybody is untalented that could go on some of the riffs that he could go
mm,
on in his interviews. In that, again, that wonderful interview, and we'll post a link to it when we put up the article, or when we post this episode here in the next couple of days. But he has this interview with Howard Smith of The Voice, and at that point, he had gained a considerable amount of weight. This is early 1970. And Howard Smith asks him about it. And Morrison responds with this wonderful riff. He goes, "Well, why is it so onerous to be fat? I don't see anything wrong with fat, you know? I mean, I remember when I used to weigh 185 pounds. I'm the same height. I was the same height that I am now, and I weighed 185 pounds. And I was going to college, and I had this food ticket at the cafeteria, and the cafeteria food is mainly all based on starch, you know? It's cheap food, right? And so I don't know what it was, but I don't know, I just felt like if you missed your meal, I just figured, well, I was getting screwed, right? If I missed a meal, I just blew it. So I'd get up at 6:30 every morning just to make breakfast, right? Eggs and grits and sausages and toast and milk. And then I'd go do a few classes and I'd make it in there for lunch. Mashed potatoes, every now and then they'd put a little piece of meat in something. Then I'd go for a few more classes and then I'd go to dinner. And it was more mashed potatoes. And so about 3 months later, I was 185 pounds. And you know what? I felt so great. I felt like a tank. I felt like a large mammal, a big beast. When I moved through the corridors or across the lawn, I just feel like I could knock anybody out of my way. I was solid, man. It's terrible to be thin and wispy because, you could get knocked over by a strong wind or something. Fat is beautiful. End quote.
In this era where it's not good to fat shame people anymore, hey Morrison, you were ahead of your time.
Yeah, absolutely. It just, but just the whole riff and there's this kind of stream of conscious history or biography. It's something wonderful to behold. That what a strange guy.
He was an oddball. I, I,
Yeah,
I read the biography, No One Here Gets Out of Live by Danny Sugarman, published in 82, I think, 82, 1980.
yeah,
It's a really good book. And to this day, I think it has aged really well as one of the most honest portrayals of Jim Morrison. Because at
yep,
that time when the book was published, a lot of the people who knew Morrison growing up were still alive. So
yeah.
he was able to interview those people, and you get a really good balanced portrayal of Morrison, not just the drunken, belligerent clown all the time. You got the intelligent, insightful, introspective guy that we just heard from now.
Yeah, and well, not only that, but yeah, you get the insufferable, fat drunken clown, but you also get the sex god in leather pants,
Right.
who's also hard to take seriously. If you just take that as an image or as a stereotype. And again, I think that we've extracted the imagery. The imagery to most of the culture has become the story,
Right.
and that actually leads in a way to our next point and our
Number
next
four.
myth. That they were just of their time and nothing else. I think that might be the cruelest myth in this whole thing.
It is. It is. And
Yeah,
I've met or spoken to a few people who believe this, and those people really don't know much about music, and fuck them.
yeah,
I.e., they weren't influential, basically, is the
yeah,
point. This is one of the most egregiously wrong, complete sack of horse shit arguments
yep,
anyone could ever make. As I said earlier about Jim Morrison as a singer, there are numerous bands who have and continue to cite the Doors as an influence. We will go into the specific artists in a roll call
yes,
toward the end of this episode. But let's just say for now that the Doors were a huge inspiration for bands and artists who delved in post-punk, goth, alternative, and indie rock. That's the hint. We'll leave it at there. More to come later. Chris?
Oh, and more of a hint, they also were proto prog rock.
Yeah, true.
That in other words, if it hadn't been for the Doors, there's a whole lot of bands in the next 15 years that followed that wouldn't have had as much permission to be as weird as they were. So
Yeah,
they kind of made being bizarre cool.
right, right.
More than most bands. I mean, again, that with all the organ stuff and Morrison, they just had a singular
Sure.
sound that did transcend, and even the stuff that sounds nothing like the Doors, in some ways, like some of the metal from the '80s too.
Right.
And we'll get into that.
Yeah.
But has that kind of sensibility as well. So nope, they're not just a billboard for 1967. Hey, remember that year?
Yeah.
Yeah, we remember that year, which is one of the reasons that we're still talking about them now because they really do transcend. They are not
Yep.
just a page in a history book. And
Mhm.
then the fifth myth, and I think that the folks that do give credence to the Doors fall into this one as well. That
Yeah.
there's this myth that their only great album was their first one, the self-titled one from '67, The Doors. We don't agree with that, right, Arturo?
Yeah. Yeah. This is clearly a myth made up by people with either questionable at best taste in music or haven't listened to anything else by The Doors besides the first album. As we'll explain later when we dive into their albums, they had a middle period where the records weren't that great, but still had some phenomenal moments in them. However, their second album, Strange Days, is made up of songs that were leftovers from their self-titled debut. Just because they didn't make the cut doesn't mean they sucked. In fact, Strange Days, being such a great album, as we'll talk about later, is a testament to how fruitful and incredible the band's output was in their early period. And their last two albums, Morrison Hotel and L.A. Woman, aren't just massively critically acclaimed, they're also two of their best-selling records, with L.A. Woman in particular generally regarded as their second best album. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if I'm keeping score, so The Doors, the first album is a great album. I've never been a huge fan of it, only because I think it's a little overwrought. But I'll admit that in some ways it's perfect. I mean, just in terms of how it flows and the sound and the template and all of that, it's pretty engrossing. But other than that, there's two other great albums, which are Strange Days and L.A. Woman. There's one very, very good one, which is Morrison Hotel. And then they have two marvelously strange ones, which are waiting.
Two albums that are flawed, with like the good parts being great and the bad parts being bad. It's like they're both half and half records.
But at the same time, they're both marvelously strange. I mean, Waiting for the Sun more so than the Soft Parades. Soft Parades does have some real shit on it. But Waiting for the Sun, even the stuff that doesn't work still works, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's an album that kind of sounds like it was made on the fly, which is what makes it such an adventure. So that's the thing. So yeah, this was a band that really did have some great albums. Obviously, they went out in a blaze of glory with L.A. Woman. For the record, Ray Manzarek, John Densmore, drummer, and Robbie Krieger, the guitarist, they went on to do two more albums without Morrison after Morrison died.
Boy, are they bad.
And they are bad albums. And so, like I said, so they went out as a great band in a blaze of glory with L.A. Woman. Everybody knows The Doors because it set the templates. It's one of the most unique and singular sounds of any album in rock history. But there were definitely a lot more shades and hues to The Doors than just that.
On this episode, we defended the legacy of The Doors. For the next episode, we're going to stay on a 1960s vibe and bring you the next installment of our second Golden Age of Rock series as we analyze the super eventful, deep, loaded year of 1969. It's the year that set the tone for the decade to come. The Beatles were coming to an end, but the Rolling Stones had begun to arguably surpass them artistically and were on their way to becoming the world's greatest rock and roll band. The Who set the stage for big-themed conceptual art rock. Led Zeppelin and the Stooges set the stage for heavy metal and punk rock, respectively. Sly and the Family Stone and Isaac Hayes set the stage for big, widescreen soul and R&B on a giant scale for the next decade. Creedence Clearwater Revival, the Allman Brothers Band, and even the band set the stage for the oncoming rush of Southern rock. And there were two massive festivals that defined the year, the decade, the era, and even a generation, for better and for worse. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you the second Golden Age of Rock, 1969. And now it's time for the brief origin story of The Doors. All right. For a band known as one of the quintessential Los Angeles bands, only two of them, drummer John Densmore and guitarist Robbie Krieger, were actually from L.A. Jim Morrison came from Florida and was raised in an upper middle class family, his father being an admiral in the U.S. Navy. Keyboardist Ray Manzarek hailed from Chicago. They met in Los Angeles in July 1965, the two being Manzarek and Morrison. Now, here's one of the many factual errors of Oliver Stone's 1991 film. If you watch it, you'll get the impression that Morrison dropped out of UCLA's film school. Not at all. He attended the UCLA Film School from 1964 to 65 and, in fact, graduated. It was during this time that he met Manzarek, who also attended the same school. They reconnected in July 1965 after they both graduated. Morrison sang some lines from a poem he had written, words that would become the lyrics to the song Moonlight Drive. And Manzarek was so impressed, he invited Morrison to join a band that he, Manzarek, was in at the time. The band was called Rick and the Ravens, where Manzarek's brothers, Rick and Jim, were guitarists, while Ray himself played keyboards. They recruited John Densmore to play drums in August of that year, and at Morrison's urging, changed their name to The Doors. Morrison was a voracious reader. Remember what I said earlier about him being
Hmm.
a highly intelligent, introspective guy? The dude loved his literature and his poetry and his philosophy. And he was a voracious reader and really huge into literature and philosophy. And he got the name from an Aldous Huxley book called The Doors of Perception. And in particular, a line that read, quote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." What is the name of the chemical that's in peyote that makes you hallucinate, Chris?
I have no idea.
Well, anyway, he wrote this book about that. He took that drug,
Ah,
the chemical
okay.
that's in the plant, and he tripped, and he wrote this book afterwards. So anyway, there you go. I never did that drug, so I can't really remember the name.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I did it once and it was interesting.
so in September of 1965, the Doors were actually a sextet. Jim Morrison on vocals, Ray Manzarek on keyboards, Ray's two brothers on guitars, Densmore on drums, and some guy named Patty Sullivan on bass. Uh, they they cobbled enough money together to pay for some studio sessions in LA's World Pacific Studios in order to cut a 6-song demo. After circulating the demo tape around to as many record labels as possible, they didn't arouse any interest at all. At this point, both of Manzarek's brothers and the bassist, Patty Sullivan, quit. The remaining three chose to soldier on, with Manzarek playing the bass on his keyboards, playing the keyboard bass on the electric piano. All they needed was a guitar player, and soon enough, through some of Densmore's connections, Robbie Krieger came on board in late 1965. From February through May of 1966, they had a residency at a supposedly sleazy dive bar called the London Fog. However, this was a formative period for the band, as this is when they developed their sound, when they wrote most of the songs that would appear on their first two albums, and they honed their live act. In May of 66, they upgraded and became the house band at the famous Whiskey A Go Go bar on the Sunset Strip. They managed to attain a strong word of mouth following throughout the summer. And eventually, Elektra Records president Jack Holzman saw them in August and was duly impressed. He came back a second time around, this time with producer Paul Rothchild, and they immediately signed them to Elektra. The rest, as they say, is history. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. When it's funny you talk about their origin story. I always love the reading about their residency at the Whiskey A Go Go and how it ended
Yeah.
when I guess Morrison was having a bad LSD trip, and so
Yep.
when they were doing the end, he decided to improvise or a retelling of Oedipus Rex, complete with very graphic language and just the whole thing of one, him being wasted, and two, him being patently offensive, got them canned. So yeah, it is interesting that kind of the spirit of that era, and a lot of bands were like this, in their first
Yeah.
couple of years, where they're honing their sound and they're touring or they're doing their residencies and they they come up out of it with a swollen catalog. So by the time they get labels interested in them, they're ready to go, and they've got like 3 albums worth of material,
Right.
and stuff that they've really honed. The Dead was like that, but even theirs probably wasn't quite as deep as
Mm,
as the Doors. I mean, the Doors had
right.
two and a half albums worth, and then
Yeah.
I mean, hell, I mean, like Indian Summer was one of these songs,
Mhm.
and that shows up on the fifth record on Morrison
Right.
Hotel 4 years later. So,
Right.
they were being fruitful from the beginning, and so yeah, to really prolific band, and just a hellacious. They basically were like a bar band on acid. like literally,
Yeah, they really were. Yeah.
literally. And so that's what kind of made them fascinating.
Speaking of tripping, Chris, I found out the chemical in peyote that makes you hallucinate is mescaline.
Mescaline. All right. I'll try to remember that for future
Everybody
reference.
out there, go get your mescaline.
Yeah, absolutely. Supposedly it has therapeutic benefits these days. Yeah, you can start thinking like a real champ.
I love how we promote drug use on this podcast. Awesome.
Yeah, yeah, which is funny considering I haven't done drugs in years. Yeah.
Really, as far as the Doors are concerned, they really only had 6 albums. The two they did after Morrison, that they did together after Morrison died, don't fucking count. No, only the Morrison era albums count. And those are the 6 we're going to talk about. The first one, the self-titled classic from 1967. With our modern day lens, it's easy to take the Doors for granted as an indispensable part of the tapestry of 1960s rock music. However, when the Doors released their self-titled debut album in January of 1967, there was absolutely nothing like it anywhere in the pop music sphere, either musically, vocally, or lyrically. Drummer John Densmore had a jazz background. Guitarist Robbie Krieger specialized in Spanish flamenco and classical guitar. Keyboardist Ray Manzarek was a blues aficionado. Jim Morrison, while also a blues enthusiast, was a huge Frank Sinatra fan. And while the two singers really didn't sound alike, they both had deep baritone voices. This enabled Morrison to borrow a lot of Sinatra's vocal phrasing and
Yeah.
apply them to a rock context, as you can explicitly hear on this and many other Doors songs, especially this on this album with the ballad "The Crystal Ship" being a sterling example of this dynamic of Morrison as a vocalist. The eclectic and unique influences from each member of the band combined to create a sound unlike any other in rock at the time. It was dark and eerie, yet deeply sensual. And thanks to Morrison's charisma and presence, charged with sexual energy and menace. It had a psychedelic element to it, but it was a mysterious, noirish kind of psychedelia. Nothing like the blissful folk rock of the Byrds
Yeah, it wasn't Donovan.
or the loosey-goosey psychedelia of San Francisco bands like the Grateful Dead or Jefferson Airplane.
Yep,
If anything,
yep, definitely wasn't Donovan.
yeah, not Donovan. Although Donovan did play with the Doors on stage a few times. But anyway, to find the closest parallel to what the Doors were doing at the time, you'd have to go all the way to New York and the groundbreaking sound of the Velvet Underground.
Yeah.
That really was the closest parallel to the Doors at the time.
Yeah, I agree.
Also, the band's stylistic diversity was startling for its time, very startling for its time and even now. Check out the Brazilian samba rhythm in the verses to the acid rock freakout of their first single, Break On Through. Check out the subversive cabaret music of pre-World War II Germany with their cover of the Bertolt Brecht Kurt Weill, the German Kurt Weill song, Alabama song Whiskey Bar. Check out the groovy surf rock rhythm of Take It As It Comes. Check out the classical music influence in the very Bach inspired keyboard intro in the Titanic pop song Light My Fire, which shot straight to #1 on the Billboard pop chart and made the Doors instant superstars. And of course, check out the creepy, disturbing, epic scaled crescendo filled take on the Oedipus myth The End, where Krieger tunes his guitar to sound like a classical Indian sitar. We're going to argue for the richness and depth of the Doors discography later on, but even then, this is still the band's definitive album. It's in the running for greatest debut album of all time, and hands down, easily one of the 100 greatest records ever made. Chris?
Yeah, definitely their quintessential record. Definitely one of the greatest debut albums of all time. And one thing about this record, and you kind of hit on it a little bit, that the Doors had this ability to, they could go really, really simple. Like Break On Through is pretty simple, even though it's got that little bit of Brazilian riff. But that and Light My Fire are essentially simple pop songs.
Right.
Uh, but then you get, like you said, you get the end, you get the Crystal Ship, you get End of the Night, which,
Mm.
that kind of spooky, uh, orchestrated, uh, uh, I don't even know what you would call it, sort of jazz pop,
Yeah, yeah.
in some respects. And but they could do it in the same song, and you hit the nail on the head with "Light My Fire." Like you said, it's got that very baroque and very sort of sophisticated intro, and just some great riffing and some great jamming in the middle of it,
Right.
and with complexity, but it all surrounds like a really simple, almost two-chord pop song.
Right. Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's not much to Light My Fire. Like the actual song Light My Fire, there's not much to it, but it's everything around it and in the middle of it
Mm.
that defines it. And so and yeah, the fact that they did have the balls to go with the Bertolt Brecht, but they also cover Willie Dixon and
Mm.
Howlin' Wolf
Yeah.
on with Backdoor Man. So the fact that
Yeah.
they're taking those chances in the midst of doing this sort of swagger psychedelic poetry
Right.
is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So
Oh.
yeah, like I said, there's a certain Morrison persona that when I was a young man that really used to annoy me, but I can't deny that it's truly, truly singular. So here I am as an old man, and I see it as being very, very singular. And so,
Yeah.
got to give it up for this album.
Yeah.
As you said, certainly one of the best debuts of all time.
Yeah. Oh, and a correction. I misspoke. Donovan did not play on stage with the Doors. I confused him with John Sebastian from the
Oh
Loving
yeah.
Spoonful.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, well, yeah. Speaking of hippy dippy, no, yeah, Sebastian actually plays harmonica on Roadhouse Blues.
Yeah, yeah. So there you go. All right. The second album by The Doors, Strange Days, also from 1967. If you listen to the album Strange Days and think, wow, this is very similar in tone and style to the first album, well, that's because these are the songs that didn't make it to the first album. The Doors had quite a large repertoire when they were a club band in 1966, as you alluded to, Chris, and they were writing songs faster than they could record them. However, do not make the mistake of thinking that these were second rate songs of any kind or of any kind of filler. Several songs in this album not only became some of the band's biggest hits in both the pop charts and among their growing fan base, but they also became staples of classic rock radio years later. If anything, Strange Days is an even darker, heavier album than the first one. Not so easy to digest, more subtle, and requiring repeated listening to uncover. This album was recorded right smack in the middle of the Summer of Love months of 1967, and that explains the record's overall druggy feel and the sheen in its sound. It's a druggier record. The first album was darker and gothier. This one is struggier. It's got a little more of the psychedelia. It doesn't have the sonic clarity of the first album, but it's not supposed to. Give enough listens and you'll realize that this was supposed to be a heavier, deeper album than the debut. In fact, let the producer, Paul Rothchild, say it himself in an interview many years later. Quote, Strange Days was the best album. It said everything we were trying to say musically, and it contained some of Jim's best poetry. We were confident it was going to be bigger than anything the Beatles have ever done. End quote. Wow, that's saying something.
Yeah.
Or how about Jim Morrison himself in a 1970 interview? Quote, I'm really proud of our second record, being Strange Days, because it tells a story. It's a whole effort. Someday it will get the recognition it deserves. I don't think many people were aware of what we were doing. Well, Jim, we're giving that recognition now. Whether there really is a narrative arc to the album is debatable, but the record is chock full of some of the Doors' signature songs. Dig the revisiting of old German cabaret music with People Are Strange, except this time it's an original with Morrison's lyrics conveying the existential angst of loneliness. I think it's a better song than the Bertolt Brecht
Oh
song.
yeah, way better.
And it charted as high as number 12 on the Billboard Pop chart. Dig the tango rhythm. See, that's the Krieger. Krieger brings the
Yeah.
flamenco. He brought the Brazilian samba. He brought in the tango rhythm and time signature of Moonlight Drive with,
Yeah.
again, Robbie Krieger, the band's secret weapon, his exquisite slide guitar guiding things while Morrison sings some of his most unabashedly beautiful and romantic lyrics. Dig the lysergic acid rock propulsion of the song Strange Days. Dig the jaunty blues romp of Love Me Two Times, a showcase for John Densmore's underrated drum skills, where he blends jazz chops with a blues feel. This charted as well, going to number 25 on the pop chart. And of course, dig the epic, dramatic art rock of When the Music's Over. Like The End, it's another long form track that ends a Doors album, but this one rocks harder with one of Krieger's greatest guitar solos on record and lyrics full of ecological environmental dread. It didn't sell as many copies as the much lauded debut album, but it still sold well over 1 million copies, got a lot of critical praise, and continued the band's upward surge as one of America's elite rock bands. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Apparently, it's kind of funny to hear Morrison say that this album tells a story. Apparently, the story includes blowjobs and multiple orgasms. I mean, love me two times is not exactly deep literature, if you know what I mean. It's so that makes me kind of laugh. But yeah, great album. I think it's in some ways it is darker and deeper than the first record in some respects, but it's also cuter. Like, Strange Days has the Moog, and People Are Strange, has kind of a, it's a little bit spooky, but it's also kind of cute. Moonlight Drive, obviously, being kind of, I mean, talk about the comparisons with Frank Sinatra. That's kind of like Morrison's Sinatra song.
Yeah.
When you think about it. And then obviously, when the music's over is a great song. And you're right. I mean, that's Krieger's finest moment with the Doors, because it has that slinkiness to it in the first half, and then like the last third of it just bashes out.
Yeah.
It comes back from a spoken word segue, and then it just bashes. And so, so there really is a diversity to this record that is pretty cool. And it's different in feel, like you said. It's more intentionally psychedelic, which is why I'm saying it's cuter. It's a cuter record than the first one, but also, again, they were a band that was very good at dabbling in the darkness.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I would say so. If anything, the strange thing is, L.A. Woman is not exactly a joyful record, but it's lighter. Yeah, their stuff certainly got lighter as it went along. So,
Right.
these first two records, they're dabbling in the darkness, but it's deep darkness.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
just really, really great to listen to. And yeah, this is, I think on a par. It's probably not quite as good as the first record. It's not. I think there's a little too much experimentation going on, and it's not quite as tight as the Doors, but it's pretty damn good. It's definitely a classic.
The next one, Waiting for the Sun from 1968. By this time, the Doors had very little left from their purple patch of greatness that provided the material for their brilliant first two albums. Starting in December 1967, they started composing songs and editing segments from their improvised jam sessions for their third album, which would eventually be called Waiting for the Sun. Unfortunately, because of the band's self-imposed pressure to put out an album for the summer and not having enough quality material, some of the songs were underdeveloped, much of it mellower and a bit more ballad heavy, and possessing more of a clean, polished sound than the previous two records in order to compensate for this lack of top shelf songs. Ironically, while the album got lukewarm reviews, it was a resounding commercial success. It became the only Doors album to hit #1 on the Billboard album chart, where it stayed for 4 weeks. Yes, Waiting for the Sun was a blockbuster. No doubt the album was boosted by the massive success of the single Hello, I Love You, which was the band's second #1 hit on the Billboard pop chart. It's one of the band's most recognizable songs, and you've most likely heard it. It's a delectable slice of psychedelic pop, even if the verse melody is stolen completely from the Kinks song
Yeah,
All Day and All
and
the
they
Night.
were at least threatened with a lawsuit over that.
They were threatened with a lawsuit. Yeah, but yeah, it is the melody from All Day and All the Night. It's a testament to the Doors' brilliance that even their most uneven album still contains some absolute crackers. Celebration of the Lizard was supposed to be a long conceptual narrative piece that was to take up the second side of the LP, but neither the producer nor the band were happy with the overall results. That ended up being a blessing because the one track that survived from the Celebration of the Lizard sessions, Not to Touch the Earth, is one of the most intense, mesmerizing, psychedelic rock monsters of a song, of not just the 1960s, but of any era. It's absolutely in my list of 10 best Doors songs ever. And I might be tempted to call it the definitive Doors song in a lot of ways. When
Yeah,
people refer to the Doors as quote unquote pretentious, the song The Unknown Soldier is probably one of the songs that comes to mind.
yeah.
While its anti-Vietnam War message is a bit heavy-handed and obvious, its creepy groove and swirling chorus makes for an exhilarating listen, even more so in a live setting if you get a chance to check it out on YouTube, especially the 1968 show at the Hollywood Bowl in L.A. My Wild Love is a startling minimalist blues chant, especially for the polished feel of this record. And the album ends with one of the Doors' best, heaviest blues rock numbers, 5-1, an elusive call to arms for a revolution of the mind and a way of being that Morrison, to his dying day, insisted was not political. The success of Waiting for the Sun helped the Doors graduate to sports arenas for their concerts and their new status as arguably the biggest band in America. But the good times weren't to last very long, though. Chris?
Yeah, this is a fascinatingly strange record. Yeah, like you alluded to, they kind of ran out of material after the first two albums, and so a lot of this album, it actually sounds like it was crafted on the fly.
Yeah.
And crafted might be an overstatement. And so, some of it, there's like really great pieces of songs. I don't know
Yeah.
if you could call them like fully realized songs. Like Not to Touch the Earth is a hell of a jam, but I wouldn't call it a fully realized song.
I think I think it's pretty tight, man. Everything
Yeah.
about that song is tight.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a tight piece of music, but it sounds like it's taken from a larger piece.
Yeah, but
You
that's
know.
what gives it its epic feel.
Yeah,
The whole stop start thing and everything.
yeah,
That
in some
eerie
ways.
keyboard, great guitar playing.
In some ways, I mean,
One of some of Morrison's best vocals ever.
yeah, I no, I agree. I think The Unknown Soldier kind of has that same feel to it too. It's almost like it's taken from a larger suite. I mean, The Unknown Soldier is probably my favorite song on this record because I think that it really is profound and artsy in the best way possible. But even like some of the throwaways are great too. Like Love Street is just like this is like this little ditty. It's a Kinksian ditty. It's kind of
Yeah.
funny. They rip off the Kinks
And then
literally.
they try to sound like them.
Yeah, they rip them off literally on "Hello, I Love You," and then the next song they rip them off figuratively. But it actually kind of works. It is kind of affecting, and it showed that Morrison was capable of being just as droll as Ray Davies.
Right.
And then Spanish Caravan is another one of those kind of fun throwaways that obviously they were riffing on the idea of the Spanish, of the Latin guitar. And then 5-1 is just an exercise in controlled id. It's just pure swagger. And I say for a band, and that's the thing about this record, for a band that didn't have a real bassist, they didn't have a full-time bassist. There's some really great bass shit on this record.
Right.
A lot of good fuzzed out bass stuff, like not to touch the earth and 5-1 especially. Really good, great fuzzy bass kind of shit. So. Like I said, strange record. It's a collection of pieces more than it is a realized whole. But like we said, some of those pieces are just fantastic. Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
And now for that problematic fourth album, The Soft Parade from 1969. As 1968 turned over into 69, the Doors were primed to make their great artistic statement, much like the Beatles did with their Sgt. Pepper's album. Their first three albums, the Doors' first three albums, sold like hotcakes in North America, and the previous album, Waiting for the Sun, did really well in both the UK and Europe. Unfortunately, Jim Morrison's increasing alcoholism had him coming apart at the seams and practically sabotaging the group. In the course of a year and a half, he had gotten in trouble with the law and arrested several times, usually having to do with his drunken antics and craziness, most notably in Hartford, Connecticut in late 1967, when he was arrested on stage for public obscenity and indecency. The charges from this incident and several others were dropped, and it really did bolster his rebellious, iconoclastic counterculture image at the time. However, his drinking was getting way out of hand as he was showing up for rehearsals and recording sessions extremely drunk, not to mention entire concerts extremely drunk. Nevertheless, the Doors managed to squeeze out a single and a teaser for their upcoming album in the early months of 1969. Touch Me was a huge hit. People forget that. Touch Me was a massive hit, going to number 3 in the Billboard pop chart, the band's third top 10 hit, written entirely by Robbie Krieger, just as he did with Light My Fire. You could tell by the lyrics. It's taken a long time for me to come around and like this song, but I now accept it for what it is, a big, unabashed pop song, filled with horn arrangements and a string section, not unlike much of the bombastic orchestral pop music being done at the time by the likes of Tom Jones and Engelbert Humperdinck. Despite it being a big commercial success, the song was frowned upon by several critics and the more hipster end of the band's fan base. The shit really hit the fan for the Doors, however, on March 1st, 1969, when they played a gig in Miami in front of 7,000 people in a former airplane hangar. It was called the Dinner Key Auditorium. Morrison, colossally drunk off his ass, attempted to spark an actual riot by shouting obscenities and allegedly whipping his dick out in front of the audience. 3 days later, 6 warrants were issued for his arrest, including those for indecent exposure, public obscenity, and profanity. He was convicted and found guilty later in September of that year, sentenced in October, and as part of the appeal process, was temporarily freed on a $50,000 bond. For the record, throughout the years, the other 3 members of the Doors and their road manager at the time swore up and down many times that Morrison never actually exposed himself. We to this day, we still don't know. Regardless, the backlash against the band was pretty bad. Several radio stations throughout the U.S. refused to play Doors records, and several concert promoters refused to promote their shows, leading to some cities outright banning the band from playing. Needless to say, this was a big hit on not only the band's reputation, but their finances as well. It was against this backdrop that they released The Soft Parade in the spring of 1969. Critics mostly panned it for its slick, poppy, heavily orchestrated sound, and the hippie hipster end of the Doors audience that wasn't too pleased with Touch Me started to show more displeasure. The album debuted at number 6 on the Billboard album chart and soon sank like a lead balloon. But is the album really that bad? Hindsight and historical revision says otherwise, with some contemporary critics over the last several years rehabilitating the album's actual worth. Count me among them. It isn't a masterpiece, Songs like Tell All the People are, like you said, Chris, a little too overwrought and reek of Broadway Showtime schlock. And Runnin' Blue, which was inexplicably released as a single, is smothered and suffocated by jazzy horn arrangements that don't match at all. And Krieger's obnoxious, hokey country music interludes are just terrible. But there's a lot to like here. Shaman's Blues rides a waltz time signature with some beautiful interplay between Ray Manzarek's organ and Krieger's guitar. The wiry, steely guitar intro to Wild Child is one of Krieger's very best riffs, don, 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 while Morrison is vocally at his most bombastic and at his alluring best. The title track begins with Morrison's now legendary poetic reading about petitioning the Lord with prayer before transitioning into a delicate, almost Baroque pop love ballad. It then segues into a proto-disco beat mixed with some warped cocktail lounge music before settling into a swampy, bluesy groove, not unlike the subterranean New Orleans funk that Dr. John was putting out at the time. Overall, I think it's a solid album that deserves credit for its songs with multi-section parts and richness in arrangements, foreshadowing the emergence of progressive rock very soon after. It was the Doors' least liked album at the time, but even though Morrison would never overcome his alcoholism, things would get artistically better for the Doors in the near future. Chris?
Yeah, this album. It's disappointing only in the sense that we're listening to a fractured band. I mean,
Yeah,
clearly Morrison and Krieger are not on the same page musically.
right.
And granted, Morrison is becoming harder to deal with and harder to work with. This album took like 9 months
Yeah.
and to record, and a lot of that had to do with Morrison's dramatics. But it's a tale of two records. There's the Krieger album, which is mostly cheesy, mostly hokey. That's where a lot of the strings and the horns and, like you said, the country interludes and some of that stuff comes in. Even though "Touch Me" is part of that. I mean, "Touch Me" is a very good single. I mean, it was born to be a single. It was born to be a radio hit.
Right.
But it still has some of that hokum to it. So you have that, and then you have the more experimental side where Morrison comes in, and the Soft Parade is really an album in and of itself. It's an 8.5
Yeah.
minute long album. It's just
Mhm.
it's all these disparate pieces, but it all works together, and it starts off earnest, it goes surreal, and it kind of goes in and out of earnest and surreal
Yeah.
throughout the whole run. And Wild Child, great song. Shaman's Blues, great song. And so the stuff that Morrison dominates is great. I mean, if it had just been a Morrison record, and if Paul Rothschild and Robbie Krieger had been so like, oh, we need to get on the radio, or we need to up the schmaltz. If they had been able to control that impulse,
Yeah.
then it might not have sold, and it might have still run afoul of some of their fans because, let's face it, it's not quite as tunesy,
Yeah. Yeah.
as the Doors. I mean, let's just, the emphasis was not on the tunes, it was more on the musical exploration, at least
Right.
on the good stuff. And so if they
Right.
had done more of the Soft Parade and Wild Child and less of Tell All the People, you
Hmm.
could have had yourself a fascinatingly great kind of cult classic record. As
Right.
it was, we get this uneven piece of crap. Yeah,
All right. Well, next, Morrison Hotel from 1970. Actually love this record.
I do too.
According to drummer John Densmore, the Doors lost about $1 million worth of gig money from all the shows that were canceled in lieu of Jim Morrison's Miami incident. Their album, Soft Parade, despite producing a big hit with Touch Me, didn't do as well commercially nor critically as their previous albums. Thanks to Morrison's drunken antics, the band's reputation had taken a big bad hit. However, something interesting started to happen toward the end of 1969. The Doors started to get their momentum back. No, they weren't invited to the Woodstock Festival in August 1969, but in addition to quickly and efficiently recording what would be their fifth album during the fall, They were invited to headline the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival,
Hmm.
appearing alongside John Lennon and his Plastic Ono Band, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Gene Vincent, and, of all people, a very young Alice Cooper. This performance was well received, and their bookings for the previous and for the following year as a live act increased. As a new decade was dawning, rock was getting heavier and crunchier. The Rolling Stones had returned to their blues roots and produced a sharper and dirtier sound. The Who had raised the bar for conceptual art rock, and their live shows were more ferocious than ever. Go listen to the Who live at Leeds. Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Black Sabbath were emerging with hard rock and heavy metal. And along with 1950s rockers starting to get attention paid to them, remember, Elvis Presley had done his enormously popular comeback TV special and was packing them in throughout his Las Vegas residencies. Creedence Clearwater Revival was finding huge success with their bluesy, country-tinged boogie rock and its clear debt to the 1950s. Seemingly and telepathically in line with this new direction rock was going in, the Doors in February 1970 released Morrison Hotel, the album that would restore their reputation as a badass rock group by refocusing the group around their blues roots, as well as reaching back and touching on the creepy, eerie, carnivalesque cabaret from hell feel of their first two albums. Critics praised the record, and it was a big commercial success as well, hitting number 4 in the Billboard album chart and actually staying in the chart for a while. It reestablished the band in the UK and Europe, hitting number 12 in the UK album chart, the highest placing they ever had in that country. And while it didn't have any pop hits like the previous albums had, the song Roadhouse Blues became a staple of the now burgeoning FM album rock format, where singles were eschewed in place of popular album tracks. All of a sudden, the Doors had become a hip and cool albums band, a development that would be key in them becoming a constant on classic rock radio 15 to 20 years later. Roadhouse Blues is raunchy, gut bucket blues rock of the highest order. The Doors flirted with funk in the second section of the song The Soft Parade, but they went into full-on funk mode with the amazing Peace Frog, one of the very best songs they ever did, where they show that they knew where black music was at the time, drawing on the grooviness of both Sly and the Family Stone and The One of James Brown. Robbie Krieger lets his guitar rip on Land Ho, and with You Make Me Real, the Doors take the surf inflections they exhibited on their debut album and infuse them with a serious punk rock energy. Queen of the Highway is the kind of mid-tempo, almost funky rock groove that the band had become experts at, while The Spy and Maggie McGill see the Doors diving into the hard blues direction they would dive deeper into on their next album. Morrison Hotel is a spectacular record and one that should be played for any Doors doubter out there. Chris?
Yeah, I certainly agree about that. I think that the heights of this record, they never rocked harder than they did on a few of the instances. Like basically the first 4 songs, Roadhouse Blues, Waiting for the Sun, You Make Me Real, Peace Frog. And that is just like one rockin' ass segment. And then, but it's also bleak. I mean, there's a rockingness to the album, but also a bleakness, like Peace Frog. You know, it's got like the coolest, like for a band with no bassist, cool ass bass line and that little a little funk riff, but also like that the last half of the song with the blood runs the streets in the town of New Haven, all that, and just blood all the way up to my ankles, yeah, it's not exactly the funnest of times to be had. But yeah, there's a diversity to this record too. Like, they slip back, like Blue Sunday is very evocative of Strange Days. So is Ship of Fools. And then they get kind of funny. Like Land Ho is a funny song. It's still bleak, but it's funny. Yeah. And then the only misstep on this record, and the thing that keeps it from being a truly great record is the inclusion of the song Indian Summer.
Mm,
which, as I mentioned before, it's clearly an outtake. It's part of their initial output, and it's clearly an outtake from the first album
right.
because he goes, he's this growly, drunken, bluesy, swaggery, sweaty rock and roll guy, and then he's back to the Indian summer. And then it goes to Maggie McGill, and he's back to being the sweaty, rockin' blues out, bash out dude. And so it just doesn't fit the rest of the proceedings. And so, I mean, so to me, that's a misstep. But I just there's a again there's a heaviness and a bleakness, but it's just a fun record. Uh,
Yeah.
Overall, I just think it's a fun record to listen to, and it's a fun record to bash out to. And just short of greatness, but pretty damn good.
No, I think it's great. I think it's a solid, very solid 4.5 star album. Okay, now we move on to the Doors' final record, L.A. Woman from 1971. While the Rolling Stones started out as a straight blues and R&B band and then became a full-blown rock band, the Doors seemingly went the opposite route with the last album they made with Jim Morrison. Starting out as an eclectic rock band, by now the Doors started to shed the fat in their sound and produced a bone dry and became a bone dry, down and dirty blues rock band. Even the non-blues songs had a decidedly bluesy
Oh yeah.
sheen and feel to them.
Oh yeah.
The album went to number 9 on the Billboard album chart, and like the previous album, stayed on the chart for most of the year. Lover Madly, the obligatory poppy love song on the album, was a big hit, climbing to number 11 on the pop chart, the Billboard pop chart. Its brisk tempo set the foundation for one of the most hook-laden and effervescent pop songs in the band's catalog. I don't care if it doesn't match the rest of the songs on LA Woman. It's one of the Doors' best pure pop songs ever. And that alone earns and warrants its inclusion. The title track, one of the most iconic Doors songs ever, has an almost motorique German,
Yeah.
krautrock groove, not unlike what many progressive German bands would employ in the near future, and not unlike what the band Can was already doing. But I doubt the Doors were familiar with Can.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, L.A. Woman, the song, is the oral equivalent of a midnight drive down the L.A. highway, longing to reach the freedom promised by the beautiful nearby hills. And of course, there's the all-time classic Riders on the Storm, the long, meditative, jazzy closing number on the album that manages to maintain a simmering, bluesy intensity throughout and is a platform for one of Jim Morrison's most subtly powerful vocal performances and most entrancing lyrics. It was also a top 20 hit on the Billboard pop chart. LA Woman is as good an album as any band can make for their last hurrah as a complete band. Arguably, if not definitely, their second best album. Morrison would move to Paris shortly after the album's release and would be found dead in his apartment's bathroom in July 1971. French officials declared it a death by heart failure, but
Well, yeah.
an official autopsy was never made.
Yeah.
Chris?
So it remains one of rock's great mysteries as to what happened to Morrison. So it's a testament to the talent of Ray Manzarek that
Yeah,
this band went as fuzzy and as scuzzy as it did and sort of rocking as it did, but he's managed to still find his place within the mix.
right.
So the mixing up the real pianos with the electric pianos on L.A. Woman,
Sure.
the electric piano, this sort of the throwback psychedelic
Sure.
organ or keys of Riders on the Storm, and then even like some of the fuzz, like keyboard bass that
Yeah.
is obviously on stuff like Crawling King Snake, and one of my actually probably my favorite song on their album besides L.A. Woman, The Changeling, which is just
Yeah.
awesome. I mean, that just bashes out. And so this album, like you said, I think it's their most intense record. I
Yeah.
think it's their most unhinged record. I think in some ways it's their most literate. I mean, it's their longest by quite a bit. It's like
Right.
10 minutes longer. or at least 5 minutes longer than any of the other records. And so, but it maintains. I think that because it has that intensity, because it has that sweep, because it bases a lot of itself on the blues, like Riders on the Storm. You kind of hit the nail on the head. That it's a weird song in the sense that it is blues. It's a 12 bar blues song,
Yeah.
but it has all those with the solos and the piano solo and the guitars in it. It's very much like a jazz piece
Right.
done as a blues song.
Right.
And so it's a neat trick, a really, really, really neat trick. Another highlight on the record is La America, which
Yeah.
is just that's about as pretentious as they got. Uh,
Yeah.
but it still works.
It still
Uh,
rocks. Yeah, it's
yeah,
great.
it still rocks. It's a great rock song, but again, it borders on pretension, but it still works. And so, yeah, truly great record at this point. And I guess one of the sad things about Morrison dying is this is what the Doors were morphing into. They were morphing into this experimental blues rock band
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
they had kind of shed the sort of the cinematic uh or organ band. They had kind of shed their goth thing
Right.
by here, and you could tell that this was a direction that they were settling into, and
Yeah,
so it's
file alongside the Rolling Stones. They're kind of
yeah,
like going in that early '70s Stones vibe,
yeah, absolutely.
much of the vibe and the feel of L.A. Woman isn't unlike, Sticky Fingers or Exile Main
Oh
Street.
no, yeah, that's actually a good call. It's very much like some of the stuff from Sticky Fingers and or
Yeah.
almost it's almost like a Mick Taylor feel to some
Yeah,
of what's going on here. So it just makes me wonder what could have been.
right.
If they had kept going down that direction, that they would have become more of a rock band as they'd
Yeah,
have gone along. They'd have become less precious and more rockish,
right.
and that would have been really truly exciting. So. So what's this band's legacy?
Well, I'm going to leave that to you because you're the big picture guy.
Okay.
Before we get to their legacy, I want to get through a roll call of bands slash artists inspired by or influenced by the Doors in ways great and small. Shall I begin?
You shall.
Okay. Let's start with Iggy Pop. Don't believe me? Go on Google and look up Iggy Pop plus Jim Morrison, and you'll see plenty of articles where Pop explicitly talks about the influence Morrison had on him as both a singer and a performer. The rich baritone and bluesy shrieking with the former, the confrontational, provocative style with the latter. The Doors performing in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the Stooges' hometown, in 1967 was the basis for this. Iggy Pop actually mentioned that specific show that the Doors played there. The pure aggression of the Doors' early music was also a direct influence on what Iggy would do with the Doors. Next, Patty
With the Stooges, you mean?
with the Stooges, right? With the Stooges, yeah.
Yeah.
Patti Smith. Smith, I mean, if you don't know Patti Smith, you should know who she is. She's the punk goddess of New York. Smith invoked Morrison's shamanistic, mystic lead singer guise and took it to another level. Smith was known for her impressionistic, abstract poetry readings in the middle of a song and working herself into a frenzy at any given song's crescendo. Guess what? That's exactly what Jim Morrison was doing in 1967. Listen to any live performance of The End or When the Music's Over. And he was doing that in the 1960s, and no one else was doing it at the time. Direct influence on Patti Smith that she herself has acknowledged. Next, Joy Division. Is any of you familiar, are any of you out there listening familiar with Joy Division?
You should
If
be.
so, well, yeah, you should be. However, if so, listen to their very first EP, An Ideal for Living from 1978. You'll notice that singer Ian Curtis sounds absolutely nothing like the heavy baritone voiced singer he would become just 1 year later. Yeah, you know why? Curtis was reportedly a huge Doors fan, and by extension, Jim Morrison. And every time that dude opened his mouth, he tried to overtly sound like Jim Morrison.
Yep.
Dude, seriously, every time Ian Curtis sang, he was trying to be
Hmm.
Morrison.
Yep.
Curtis, like Patti Smith, also tried to channel the shamanistic poet of darkness and doom character that Morrison perfected in the 1960s. Joy Division, along with The Cure, were a gigantic touchstone for the subgenre of goth. And aside from Morrison, it was a touch of the Doors' dark, eerie, ominous vibes in their music was a massive influence on Joy Division, and it was. And if you acknowledge that, then you have to acknowledge that the Doors were very much in their way proto goth.
Yep.
Uh, Next, Echo and the Bunnymen. The aspect of the Doors' music that deeply influenced Ian McCulloch and his crew was the sense of melodrama. And like Patti Smith before them, surrealistic impressionism in their lyrics. This is especially evident in the Bunnymen's mid-period classic albums, such as Porcupine from 1983 and the masterpiece Ocean Rain from 1984. The latter especially has string arrangements that could have easily been borrowed from the Doors' Soft Parade album. Robbie Krieger's flamenco-flavored guitar licks can be heard in much of guitarist Will Sargent's playing on the record. Very few frontmen and front women in history could take the mundane and innocuous and make great, epic, poetic vocal expressions out of them like Jim Morrison did, and Ian McCulloch certain copped that trick. Next, The Cult. The Cult had their big moment of popularity in the late 1980s. They were essentially 1960s hippie rock with heavy cock rock guitar muscle. Imagine if Jimmy Page joined the Doors instead of Robbie Krieger. And singer Ian Astbury was so enthralled to Jim Morrison as a singer, performer, and overall frontman that many years later in the mid noughties or mid aughts, he actually donned the guise of Jim Morrison
Yes, he did.
to perform with Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger in a version of the Doors called The Doors of the 21st Century. Next,
Yep.
Pearl Jam. For a guy who supposedly idolizes Neil Young and the Who, not only does Eddie Vedder as a singer owe a great deal
Yeah. Sounds
to
like
the
Morrison.
influence to the
Yeah.
influence of Jim Morrison as a vocalist and having the intensity as a stage performer and actor that Morrison had, that Vedder also borrowed from and was influenced by. My God, just listen to the man, listen to Vedder, and watch some Pearl Jam live shows on YouTube to get the gist. But the music of the Doors really were impactful on Pearl Jam's early sound, particularly Pearl Jam's classic debut album, 10. Several of the songs feature Stone Gossard employing almost the same guitar arpeggios that Robbie Krieger employed in early Doors classics, where he was emulating the sitar on the guitar. See the intros to Garden and Release. Another thing about Vedder and the Doors connection. In July 2007, Densmore did not join Krieger and Manzarek in that reformation with Ian Astbury. Densmore said he would not join the reconfigured band unless it was fronted by Eddie Vedder.
Hmm.
Densmore said, quote, "I played with Jim. If there's someone on that level, okay. I'm not going to join them with Ian. That's not to diss Ian. Ian is a good singer, but he's no Jim Morrison. But Eddie Vedder, my God, that is a singer." By the way, Eddie Vedder did perform with the three surviving Doors during the Doors
The Hall of
1993
Fame.
Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Yeah, and they
Yeah.
did Roadhouse Blues.
Yep.
So, yeah. So those are some bands right there and artists that were deeply influenced by the Doors, but really influenced by Jim Morrison.
Yeah, and in terms of the Doors and in terms of their sort of their greater influence, I would add a couple of things. I would say one, prog rock owes
Yeah.
a huge debt to the
And
Doors.
you hear it on the Soft Machine, the Soft Parade. You hear it?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you hear it on the Soft Parade, and yeah, but you hear it on that, but also just it gave a lot of bands permission to be weird.
Yeah.
And Manzarek gave a lot of permission to a lot of bands to play with keys,
Yeah.
ELP,
Yeah.
Genesis, Pink Floyd. I mean,
Yeah.
Roger Waters wanted to be Jim Morrison when he grew up. But
Yeah.
the best he could muster was madness and full fascism.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think the King Crimson in some ways too, the kind of the
Yeah.
dramatics
Yeah.
owe a debt to the Doors. So that's one thing, prog rock. The other thing would be their influence on iconoclasm in general. That
Mm.
rock and roll is a very iconoclastic art form, and so there's this mythos of the front man, and
Right.
so it's hard to see Perry Farrell and Axl
Yeah.
Rose,
Right.
like two
Right.
examples,
You know,
doing what they did and having the swagger that they did and having that
Jim
sort of,
Morrison provided the template for those two guys
yeah,
in particular, and those are also LA rockers, just like Morrison.
yeah. And so this sort of self-styled iconoclast template was formed by Morrison, and those guys went and ran with it. So those are more sort of not direct influences, but sort of overarching umbrella influences would be on prog rock and iconoclastic LA frontmen.
And also LA frontman, Morrison, LA frontman, really from Florida. Perry
Hmm.
Farrell, LA frontman, really from New York. And
Yeah.
Axl Rose, LA
Yeah,
frontman, but really from
really from
Indiana.
Indiana. So LA imports.
Yeah, all LA imports.
So like Martians landed on LA.
Yeah.
Uh and all
I would
Go
like
ahead.
to end this though, Chris. Um,
Yeah.
Before we get into what their legacy should be, and I'm gonna give that to you. I would like to give a quote by you know who.
Who's that?
Our favorite rock critic, Robert Christgau. This is
Ah,
from his website, and this is from his 2001 review of the compilation, The Very Best of the Doors. He gave it an A. He gave it a very good review and a bit of a backhanded compliment because this is Robert Christgau. This is what he does. Even when he's praising an artist, he's still being kind of a dick. Anyway, here's the quote: Shaman, poet, Lizard King, believe that guff and you will miss a great pop band. Assman, Schlockmeister, Cosmic Slimeball. That's where Jim Morrison's originality lies, and he's never been better represented. Right beneath the backdoor macho resides a weak-willed whine just as LA as Jackson Brown's, and the struggle between the two would have landed him in Las Vegas if he hadn't achieved oblivion in Paris first. Compelling in part because he's revolting, Jimbo, meaning Morrison, reminds us that some assholes actually do live with demons. His three sidemen rocked almost as good as the Stones. Without him, they were nothing. End quote.
yeah, I agree with that. And that's actually a good call. It's prescient by Chris Gow that the Doors would have been a Vegas band.
Without him,
Yeah.
Morrison, yeah.
Yeah, well, or even with Morrison, they would have probably ended up as a Vegas band because of, again, he as a singer, he was on
Yeah.
a par with
Yeah.
some of those Vegas lizards.
Yeah.
So in
Yeah.
some ways they could have like they could have redefined Vegas if you think about it. It's almost exciting to think about like the Doors do Vegas. Of course,
Yeah.
these days anybody would do Vegas. I mean
Yeah.
the
You
rem
you two you two's doing it, and Fish is doing it soon.
yeah, and the remnants of the dead are going to be the next act at the Sphere,
Yeah.
which is apropos of the baby boomers. What are you going
Yeah.
to do? So
Yeah.
let's talk about this band's legacy then. So what is the legacy of the Doors? I would say there's a few things. One, musical
Mhm.
adventuresomeness, uh,
Adventurousness.
adventurousness.
Yes.
Thank you, English teacher. Musical adventurousness is, I think, first and foremost their main legacy. They taught a lot of folks that risk taking was to be celebrated and to be sought. That they, you know, whereas like Brian Wilson was innovative and he was a risk taker in the sense that he was doing things with vocal harmonies that no one could imagine. He wasn't like taking he wasn't taking like whole instrumental palettes and dropping them down into rock and roll. Like the idea of unleashing Ray Manzarek in a mainstream rock band
Yeah.
back then must have been just a wild concept. And I can
Right.
just imagine just the reception that they must have gotten. So it's that adventurousness, and the fact that they didn't stick to the they created one template with the first album, The Doors, and then they created another one with L.A. Woman.
Right.
And so the fact that they never lost that spirit, that I think is one thing that they represent. The other main theme besides musical adventurousness is iconoclasm.
Hmm.
That, this idea of,
And that came from Morrison.
and that came from Morrison. And so the idea that rock and roll at its very essence is a storytelling format.
Right.
And rock and roll is only, as a storytelling format, is only as good as the quality of its storytellers.
Right.
And Morrison, as a storyteller, as a interpreter, as a frontman, as a dominator, as a conversation piece in and of himself, was pretty
Uh-huh.
much unmatched.
Right.
And so the fact that and that he was able to go in as many directions as he could. So yes, he was the guy in the leather pants. Yes, he was the fat guy in the beard singing Roadhouse Blues. But he also was the guy who came up with the Soft Parade. He's also the one that conceived of the Firing Squad and the Unknown Soldier.
Right.
He also was the one that came up with the end, and
Right.
all of that apocalyptic, hellish, riding the snake imagery at
Mhm.
the end of that. And so, very, very bold, very visionary guy. And I think that there's never, I don't think in the history of rock and roll, you can say that there was a perfect rock and roll front man, maybe
Mhm.
besides Mick Jagger.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Or Freddie Mercury.
yeah, there's Mercury too, but Mercury as a singer and as a performer, I mean, there's two sides of the coin. There's the alluring storyteller, and then there's the showman.
Right. Mercury's the showman, Morrison's the storyteller. Yeah.
Yeah, Morrison's the storyteller and kind of embodies the art, whereas Mercury's just a pure showman. So I think that though there's those things, and then I would also just say that they're also a testament to the fact that why podcasts like ours exist. There's no limit
Right.
to the creativity of rock and roll.
Right.
There's no bounds. There's no boundaries. It's
Yeah.
it's it's all excitement all the time if you do it right. And the Doors were about as exciting as it got. And with that, as we always do at the end of these episodes, we encourage you to join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook. Uh, it's a good forum. Arturo is winding through to the latter part of his best studio albums by years. And it's getting to be kind of fascinating because we're in the era that people our age stop caring. Uh,
Yeah.
2010, now 2011 is coming up, and so you're starting to see this fracture of communal experience into kind of following your own muse, and so seeing it get nichey is kind of fun. Anyway,
2011 is the next one.
yep, 2011 is the next one. Anyway, facebook.com/curmudgeon/groups/curmudgeon rock. Have a lot to say. Do you disagree with our take on the Doors? Do you disagree with my take during the parallel universe on being fair to bands that do power pop? Let us know. curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And also, wherever you're accessing this podcast, check out the show notes for a link to a Spotify playlist that will have all 6 of these Doors albums stored within.